Morning, bon dia. Today I'm here in the Ipiranga Museum in Sao Paulo, and I'm going to do a painting of this scene. I'm painting on an oil-primed linen canvas that I've toned to a sort of dullish green, and I really love the architecture here, those tropical Brazilian trees as well, so I think this should be fun to paint. Remember, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel, and let's start painting.
Here I'm sketching in the structure of the museum using a pencil. I normally start my paintings by sketching with paint, however for a scene like this with a lot of intricate architecture, I find I have more control and a greater ability to draw the details using a pencil rather than a brush. I'm now going in with a thinned down colour mix of raw umber and ultramarine paint to sketch in the darker shapes in the composition, starting with this huge palm tree on the right. I'm now massing in these trees on the right of the museum, and for the time being I'm grouping the whole section of trees together and painting the overall shape and mass of trees with the same colour mix. On my palette I'm now mixing the colour for the blue sections of sky. Here I'm using titanium white, cobalt blue and a small touch of ultramarine blue. Notice how as I mix the colours I'm using my palette knife to pick up the paint and mix the colours rather than a brush. The advantage of using a palette knife is that you can pick up a lot more paint and you can easily make bigger colour mixes which will last longer, and also it's cleaner to use as I can easily wipe the paint completely off the palette knife using a tissue, whereas when using a brush the colours can get stuck in the hairs of the brush and this can muddy the colours a bit as a result. I'm now mixing a lighter colour mix for the clouds in the sky. I'm using titanium white, cadmium yellow, a bit of the blue sky mix that I've already made, and I also add a touch of carmine red, so I make a slightly warm off-white. I'm now mixing a light colour for the Museum do Ipiranga, and I'm using titanium white and cadmium yellow. Here I'm using that light blue colour mix to paint the sections of the sky breaking through the clouds. I find it helpful to try and paint the areas of saturated colour like the blue in the sky in the first layer of paint, as by painting directly onto a dry section of the canvas my colour mix stays pure, whereas sometimes if you wait until a later stage it can be a bit of a battle to try and get the clean colour on your painting without it mixing with the colours underneath that you've already placed on the painting. And for this same reason, I'm also leaving the sections where I'm going to paint these clouds as blank sections of canvas for now, as these are some of the highest key areas in the scene, so I want to be able to paint this very light colour mix directly onto the areas where the clouds are going to be, and not to have to deal with other layers of wet paint darkening these sections in the process. As I continue with the sky, I'm painting it around the outline of my initial pencil sketch, but as I do, I'm varying and softening these brush strokes to create the appearance of the sky going behind the museum, and not just painting a blockish outline of the sky around the contour. And if you're curious about the history of this museum, I actually visited it the day before painting this to find out a bit about it. So it was made to commemorate the independence of Brazil, and the name Ipiranga is the name of the river where Dom Pedro declared Brazil's independence from the Kingdom of Portugal. And inside there's a very impressive painting of this scene called Independence or Death, or Independência ou Morte in Portuguese, painted by the Brazilian artist Pedro Americo, and it is really spectacular, so the museum is worth visiting just to see that painting. And there were lots of other great paintings inside too, and even a painting of the museum from a similar viewpoint to that which I'm painting here, although the trees hadn't grown to such an immense size back when that painting was painted. And in my previous video I filmed a vlog visiting the museum, so I recommend checking out that video if you're interested. As I paint the museum, I start by painting the lightest sections on the front plane of the building, which are getting lit by direct sunlight. I'm applying the paint thickly to these areas with none of my medium mixed into the paint. I also mix a shadow mix which is darker and cooler in colour temperature, as these sections of the shadows are receiving reflected light from the blue sky. And I also mix another shadow value which is a lot warmer and slightly lighter in tonal value than the cool shadow colour. And this warm shadow is for the areas of the building which are facing downward and therefore receiving bounce light from the sunlight hitting the ground and then bouncing up and illuminating these sections with an orange hue, which I'll add to the painting later on. As I paint these straight lines in the architecture, I'm using quite a fine filbert brush. I find the chisel shape of the brush very useful, as when turned so that the finest point of the brush is in line with the direction of the mark I need to make, the bulk of the hair on the brush supports the brush stroke better than if I used a round pointed brush, which tends to bend and widen as the brush stroke moves down the canvas. To paint the pillars, I'm simplifying them by painting vertical blocks of paint for the 4 sections on the facade of the museum. And rather than rendering the architecture detail for detail, I'm focusing on the big shapes of colour and value, and like a sculptor working at a block of marble, working from big to small and gradually refining the details as I go. Using a pointed round brush, I'm now painting the darker shadows of the doorways in between the pillars at the front of the building. I'm not using black on my palette, however I can create a nice deep dark using a mix of raw umber and ultramarine blue. In general, when painting buildings and objects in sunlight, the shadows tend to have a subtle gradation, with the sections closer to the ground receiving more warm bounce light from the ground, and the areas higher up receiving more cool light from the blue sky. These subtleties in hue are often lost in photographs where shadows are often compressed to near black, so working directly from nature and observing these subtle shifts in hue is one of the joys of painting en plein air. To refine the contours of this palm tree, I'm using the light colour mix that I made for the clouds to carve into the dark green mass to bring out some individual palm tree leaves known as fronds. I don't need to paint all of these palm fronds to make the tree appear realistic, However, it is important to paint the fronds which are framed against the sky with an accurate attention to detail, as due to the contrast in value between the light sky and the dark green, this edge will be a point that the viewer's eyes are naturally drawn to, and if I can paint this accurately, then the viewer's eyes will subconsciously fill in the other sections in the mass of leaves and recognize this as a palm tree. Here I'm using a fine pointed round brush to paint the contour of the trees on the right of the museum. Where the trees meet the sky, the characteristic shapes of the trees become more visible, and here I'm trying to capture these shapes accurately. Using the colour mix that I made for the facade of the museum, I can paint on top of the palm tree in a few areas to create the impression of the gaps between the leaves, revealing what is behind it. When painting these sections, I'm applying the paint quite thickly using a filbert brush, and I'm applying the marks boldly with short, definitive movements. As if I fiddle with the brushstroke too much, the green of the palm tree will mix with this light paint for the building and would create a dull, light green as a result, and wouldn't look like the building behind the palm tree. I like how this path in the foreground is light in value, similar to the value and colour of the museum. This way it acts as a compositional tool, leading the viewer's eyes from the foreground to the background where the museum sits. This light value of the path also balances the light values of the sky and the building, connecting the lower half and the upper half of the painting. Using the narrow side of a filbert brush, I'm now painting in a few figures into the scene. This helps give scale and grandeur to the Ipiranga Museum, and it also helps give scale to these huge trees which surround it.
Hi guys, so I hope you enjoyed that video of me painting the Ipiranga Museum here in Sao Paulo. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and do subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next video in another location in Brazil.